Hey y'all, we are the good doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Erin.
I'm Dr. Kristen.
And we're in this weird in-between period, filling time and YouTube space before the season of The Crown starts in a few weeks. And all of October, we kind of covered ladies and suffrage and politics, all those things. So we're going to stick with the ladies. And we're going to stick with something we like to talk about because it's important, not because it's a happy story. So we're covering the 2019 documentary on HBO, At the Heart of Gold, inside the USA Gymnastics Scandal. We already have two hot-ish takes about this scandal, and we're not done talking about it because it's such an important story. It's such a massive story with so many different implications. All joking aside, we honestly felt, yeah, we still have more to say about this. And, you know, it's worth just reminding people, in case you forgot, that this story is out there and that these women and survivors are out there. And so we watched this documentary again.
Yeah, and from my perspective too, both of us we're not collegiate athletes, let's be clear, but we both went to colleges with athletes.
We were both athletes at one stage in our lives.
And we have had interactions with collegiate athletes, either professionally or as being friends with them. And the idea that this just happened at Michigan State is hilarious. And if you look at how they handled Michigan State, let's rewind. So for anyone who hasn't watched our hottish takes or doesn't really know what we're talking about,
right?
This particular documentary focuses on one facet of this, but the summary of the story is that in 2016, the Indianapolis Star, paper heroes of mine now for ever, them in the Boston Globe, we need investigative journalists. Got wind of a pattern of behavior within USA Gymnastics that allowed abusive coaches to foster and to be fostered and to thrive within the system. Mm-hmm. And then this incredible, I don't have words in the English language to describe how I feel about Rachel Den Hollander, but this hero, Rachel Den Hollander, who was an elite gymnast, not an Olympian, but an elite gymnast, called them and said, actually, I was abused by the team doctor for years, and I don't think I'm the only one. And that just cavalcaded this whole thing.
Yeah.
So Larry Nassar is currently in jail and will be there. He was sentenced to 175 years in prison for all of his various crimes. But it started kind of there, and we realized that he was fostered and approved and nurtured within a system that directly Bella and Marta Caroli had control over, John Geddard at a particular gym had control over, Steve Penny had control over at USAG, and Michigan State had control over. So there were four institutions that had the opportunity to stop him at various times and didn't. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of evidence before you come at us with anything. There was lots of evidence all along the way that people knew. There's paper trails.
Yeah, and there were complaints, I think as early as 1996, 1997, because one of the young gymnasts said, I was 3 when that first person came forward about Larry Nassar's behavior. And she said, think of all the people that could have been saved from this experience. And they get into detail about the different times that various women were gaslit and told, no, this isn't happening. No, it's not what you think it is, and silencing and gaslighting was the policy across the board at all of these institutions.
And what we're discovering too, the more that we watch about this and the more that we think about it, is that gaslighting seems to be gaslighting is the practice where somebody says to you, I feel this way. And you say to them, no, you don't really feel this way.
Yeah. Or this is what happened. And you say to them, no, that's not what happened.
Oh, that's not what happened. You misunderstood. And it can be really subtle. I think every human has gaslit another human accidentally. It can be really, really subtle, or it can be really, really insidious. It comes from a movie with Ingrid Bergman, by the way. And so the culture of the sport of gymnastics is one of gaslighting. Because part of gymnastics, it sounds like it is incredibly brutal on adult bodies and downright harmful to child bodies. Mm-hmm. And so they have to convince themselves, they have to self-gaslight that they're not in pain. all the time in order to do this sport at the level that they want to do it at. And so any abusive entity, being an institution or an individual, has a lot easier time preying upon folks who are already predisposed to not trust themselves.
Yeah.
And so, this feels wrong. I don't know why this man's hands are inside my vagina when he's trying to fix my ankle injury. And then an adult says to you, oh, but he's a doctor. He knows what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to go, oh, okay, I guess.
Yeah. And the other thing that, like, because I think both of us ended up at this watching of it, thinking about the systems in place and the larger cultural systems of these organizations that allowed for a person like Larry Nassar to do so much damage. And, you know, it's really any situation in which, you know, the bulk of the people in it are like very harsh, masochistic, strict, severe gaslighting personalities, which they show you a lot of these people throughout the documentary. And like nobody was nice to these girls. Nobody. Not one person in their professional experience was nice to them except for Larry Nassar. So of course you're going to think that he's a nice person. He gives you food when you've been starving. He listens to you. He lets you cry. He believes you when you say that you're in pain. Like all of these things that you would think, oh no, that's not how professional Olympic athletes are treated. Like we revere them. They're phenomenal. The thing that stuck with me from this documentary was one of the older gymnasts said, you know, being an elite gymnast is like being a wounded animal. And I paused and I like sat with that for a minute because, and I know we talked about this in our last Hottish Take, but it's worth saying again, there's a level of complicitness for all of us in this culture because we adhere to this idea that there's nothing more important than winning.
Yeah. And I was quite convicted at the end of this documentary when one of the girls who testified against Nassar, or I should say, nobody had to testify because it was so open and shut at the end of the day, and he took a plea deal. But the incredible judge allowed victim impact statements. And this documentary is one of the ones that spends, of all the properties we've watched, that spends the most time on that with like listening to victim impact statements. So there is not a single property about this case that I've run across that I wouldn't recommend. Like they've all been handled with care. They've all been done really well. This in particular was directed by Erin Lee Carr, who is one of my personal favorite documentarians. She is an incredible storyteller with a really deft interview technique too. Like she gets a lot of vulnerability without, I think, being harmful. Mm-hmm. And we've never heard from her subjects that she is. So anyway, so you really sit with a lot of the victim impact statements. This one gymnast said, like, I can finally go back to gymnastics. Now that I've purged him from my soul, I can go back. And my immediate thought was, why are you bothering? You're not going to be an Olympian. And I, as an American citizen who very, very honestly, like had Carrie Strugg's 1992 vault on VHS tape for years, it never occurred to me that people could do gymnastics just for funsies. Yeah. I have been programmed to think if you don't make the Olympic team, any time you spent doing gymnastics was useless.
Was wasted. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I started out in gymnastics when I was 6. Or no older than that, but it doesn't really matter. Eventually I was too tall and I was told I was too tall, and that was it. I was done. There was no point to me continuing in pursuing any of the skills that I could possibly learn because I wasn't going to be able to do the uneven bars. And like, what was the point? And I never thought about it at the time. Obviously I was like 10 or 11. I went on to play volleyball instead, which is actually a good thing if you're tall. But like thinking about that just now as we were reflecting before we started filming, I was like, why couldn't I have just continued to like tumble? Like there's lots of things you can do that it's okay that you're a little bit taller, but like, no, there's no point.
Yeah. And like sports are not my thing to participate in. I was a swimmer for a long time and I enjoyed it, but I definitely tried to be a gymnast and it didn't work out for a whole lot of reasons. But the thing I loved the most about gymnastics was tumbling passes. I loved that power. I loved having that ownership over your body to be able to move it in different directions. And that's why I resonate a little bit more with yoga now than I do with some other things emotionally. But I think, so the part of the country that I was raised in particular is hyper competitive. I think as a culture, in terms of the United States, like the mid-Atlantic Northeastern seaboard is pretty competitive. And the school district that I grew up in was very competitive. I grew up with a father who is incredibly competitive, and I am an incredibly competitive person. And one of the things that I have had to unlearn in my adulthood is the definition of productivity. Mm-hmm. And so as soon as I thought that, like, oh my God, why are you bothering? You can't be an Olympian, so why are you bothering? I had to remind myself that enjoyment and joy are productive entities. Mm-hmm. And that the only reason that she needed to be able to do this was that it made her happy.
Yeah.
That's it. Like, first do no harm and then do you. Let that be your guiding light of life. It certainly has become mine. Like, she wasn't harming anyone by hanging out in a gym and training her body and having fun flinging herself around a vault. And sure, maybe she goes to competitions, but like, why is that any less valid than my uncle who does barbershop as a hobby and goes to barbershop competitions? There's no Olympic in barbershop. Like,
and it's so countercultural to even just have those thoughts. And, you know, especially during these COVID times, there's been a lot of shaming around what you are and aren't doing as you spend so much more time at home.
If you particularly make sourdough, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, like, oh, everyone's baking bread and everyone's doing, and I'm like, everybody.
We'd like to introduce you to two people who are not baking bread, by the way, not making sourdough right here.
No, and it just so happens that the hobbies we do practice produce things, in a way, but like, it's this idea that somehow you're wasting your time if you're not producing things. And there are days when I don't in the evening cross stitch and I just watch television, and that's okay too. So like, it's changing this cultural idea that for something to be valuable, it has to be productive. Is really important. And like, it's a lesson I didn't remember getting from this story
the first time,
but I'm glad I got it this fifth time or whatever.
Yeah, I think I was so busy being angry the first time.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, that's
a lot of my anger has burned out at this because let me articulate this well. I have been perpetually reminded in the last 2 years that other humans' brains do not work like mine do. And I think fundamentally that's why I get so angry about these things. Because I've been in situations where a student came to me and said this wasn't right, and I followed the rules. I immediately called CPS, or I went to my direct supervisor and said, I think we need to pull these parents in. I think we need to have a conversation. We documented things appropriately. We told the students what we were going to be doing so that they knew they were heard and listened to and safe. Mm-hmm. And then the police didn't do anything, or the organization didn't do anything for any number of reasons. And that always frustrated me as to why, but I followed the rules. I did my job. Why aren't you doing yours?
Yeah.
And I will say I've never reported anything where I thought physical abuse was happening. Definitely never something where I thought sexual abuse was happening, or trust me, I would have gone above my boss. It was a little bit more of misunderstandings about parents or things like that. The CPS situation was resolved and actually did go on, and the child was taken to a safer family member. But a lot of the times where things weren't followed up, for me, they were more ethical conversations than child safety conversations. This is a child safety conversation. Mm-hmm. This isn't an ethical conversation. This man was abusing children. Mm-hmm. And if he wasn't abusing children, which I don't understand why we stopped believing children at any point in time. They often don't have the capacity to lie. We teach people how to lie. We are not born with the ability to lie unless you are a statistical sociopath. You have to be taught how to lie about your experiences. And so children don't often know how to do that. Mm. So why don't we believe children, and I know why we don't believe women, because rape culture and patriarchy and all those kind of other things. But I am furious at like a low simmer now, because my response is like, well, of course people did this because they're always going to protect institution over individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to a university that had its own sexual assault scandal that I don't think was handled appropriately. And it has damaged my relationship with that institution forever. And I'm not somebody who does blind loyalty ever. But for me, there's something in this about, no matter how many times I hear this story, I'm still like, okay, well, it could have changed. How many points in time could somebody have done something different? And then how do I, in my low rage, like, okay, not everybody thinks the way that I do. I saw all these points of light. And how do I then advocate in the future when we all as humans always assume everybody else thinks the same way we do. We always assume everybody understands us immediately. We always assume that we've done that. It's human nature. So how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Because institutions will always protect themselves.
Right.
Power will concede nothing.
Never does.
So how is more my animating reaction now instead of burn them all alive?
Yeah. What can we do? What can we do to change this story so that it doesn't happen again? To change the reality of the situation, the way systems function, the way organizations function, the way we tell stories and who we believe. Like, so I think that's anytime you are faced with such a harrowing story as this, it's really painful to sit with. And we've both gone through over the last 2 years a lot of pain, empathetic and sympathetic pain in watching this and living with these stories. But yeah, you get to a certain point where you're like, okay, now how can we do things differently? And so that's, I think a positive lesson to get from this is an action-oriented one. Sitting with anger is needed a lot of the time. But eventually I think that it leads you to action, hopefully.
Yeah, in my faith tradition, we talk about bearing witness to things. And Dr. Aaron and I talk about this a lot, about that there are documentaries we watch that are hard sits because we have to bear witness. We have to, we feel a social responsibility to not let these stories exist in a void. A lot of our emotional, we don't research happy things in our academic life. No. And a lot of it, when I tell my brother, even what I'm reading on a day, he's like, there's something wrong with you. But I do feel a great emotional impetus to bear witness. And I think a lot of people on the planet do. But then bearing witness is really hard to do when you don't have an animating reaction. And so there's a great line from a song by Brooke Fraser that says, "Now that I have seen, I am responsible." But what do we do with that responsibility? Where do we go next? And so I think in this particular case, we've actually been given some markers along the way, which is don't stop agitating. Don't stop, document everything.
Yeah.
And be angry and articulate in front of the right people. Yeah. Part of the reason that Rachel Denhollander is the one who blew this all up was because she knew what she was doing. She had the training. She was a lawyer, and she knew how to build the case. And so part of it is finding experts who know how to blow up what's happening. Mm-hmm. Another animating feature is tell things. Secrets have power because they're secrets, and truth has power because it's truth. And often those things are at crosshairs. And so we need to get over any sort of cultural understanding we have of well, that's not anyone else's business, or we got to keep things within the family or things like that. If dangerous and abuses are happening, we have to learn how to talk. As a leader, as an organization, the reaction that you should have to this is to understand harassment policies within your building and enforce them unilaterally and fairly, and listen to everyone.
Yeah.
Investigate your own self for how you may be potentially gaslighting people. Accept people's stories for what they are. Research the facts they've given you. And that's it. Your gut reaction to something, unless you were physically a part of the conversation, should never be, oh, that could never have happened.
Mm.
It should always be, that surprises me, but let me investigate. That's, maybe that's not been my experience. So let me go and get some more data. That's fine. Like, that's honest. Like, that is what it is. So in terms of animating reactions to this ongoing crisis, because Steve Penny is still in jail, he has not gone to trial. I want to be clear to you, one of the other curiosities is that we haven't talked about any of the coaches in that Indianapolis Star article.
Nope.
And I think we can all start rattling off some other athletic department names at universities around the country who have either been shamed or have not been fired. Larry Nassar was allowed to retire from USAG, and they knew what he was doing. There's the whole conversation around Jerry Sandusky in Pennsylvania. And I think the conversation around Joe Paterno and Jerry Sandusky will continue for many generations. So this isn't an isolated incident.
No.
There's something about athletic departments that lets predators kind of hang out, and we should be thinking about that. But from your personal perspective, what I would say is to don't shut up. Be the squeaky wheel. Yeah.
So that is our updated thoughts and feelings about the USA Gymnastics story and scandal involving Larry Nassar and everyone else we've talked about. Et al. All the other institutions and coaches and leaders and people who failed these women and girls. And next up, we're going from joy to joy. And when you see us next week, we're going to have some interesting thoughts and discussions about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which, if you don't know what it is, we'll tell you, but it's very interesting, horrible, but interesting story, particularly for how it relates to the treatment of women and girls in work situations and humans in work situations and the labor movement and the New Deal. So stay tuned for that.
Who knew?
I know.
See you next week. Bye.
Bye.